Hello everybody, and thank you for the invitation. Two things, random things to know about me before we start with all the science and everything gets really smart. I collect orchids, species from Tibet, hybrids, and from Ecuador. I love botanical gardens, so I'm interested a bit more in the synthetic systems on this planet, and of course there we go to agriculture. And I have never given a talk this long, so please give me as much feedback as you can afterwards. So, to get to the science, I have a master's degree in conservation ecology and biodiversity management. For this, I looked at dry grassland in the Wachau region, which is the westernmost part of Pannonia. It's sort of the little horn of Pannonia along the Danube. I looked at invaded sites, second picture, native oak forests, and then what happens when Robinia really takes over, and then Ailanthus comes to play, those forests. Lastly, then I worked for conservation consultants with consulting agency, which is more about participation and about stakeholders, which was very interesting. But then ultimately I landed at the Bioinvasions, Global Change and Macroecology group at the University of Vienna. So now you know a bit about me. My talk is titled Past, Present and Future Weeds. Now we haven't quite gotten to the future part yet, so I'm going to present more on the past and present and then go a bit into future perspectives at the end. You know where you are. So an intro. I'm going to give a brief what's what about the world of weeds. Please feel free to ask questions anytime, and also if you can't hear me, wave or something. So I really project my voice. First things first, what brings me here? As Stenka already mentioned, we have the Agri-Weed Clean project, which deals with weeds under climate and land use change, the University of Vienna, the Austrian Agency for Health and Food Safety, and your university here. The idea is to produce a risk map of the top 20 emerging weeds in the study area you can see here in green, which we sort of refer to as Central Europe. Right now we're more at the large biodiversity change assessment stage of the whole project, but that is very interesting. Of course, very important, this will be my PhD, so that's the other reason I'm here. So, first question, what makes a weed a weed? Now, species are labeled weeds for very many reasons, and these definitions are not really overlapping, sometimes they're exclusive. In agriculture, people label weeds because of their impact, so species that have a high impact on crop productions. Ecologists tend to label them by habitat, so the word sagittal species, sometimes in English you read arable species, which is similar, I think. Is used, and then we have all these mixed definitions. If you were to go to the US Department of Agriculture, noxious weeds would be invasive non-native species. It's a very different thing than maybe what we would see as weeds. So it's very important to keep that in mind when you read something about weeds, to check their definitions, because sometimes you get halfway through an abstract and you realize, okay, this is absolutely not what I wanted to read. So that means we can have native weeds, alien weeds, we can even have endangered weeds, as well as small species like Arabidopsis, which really has no impact in terms of crop. So is it a weed? Well, if we think about weeds as this negatively connotated word, then probably not really. So the answer is clearly it depends. So our definition, and for the next hour this will be the definition that I'm going to use, is weeds are species of vascular plants that growing in arable habitats that cause substantial damage to crops. This can be as disease vectors, this can be by direct or indirect competition. There's all kinds of mechanisms, but they have to cause some kind of damage. And some of them may also cause damage to livestock or humans. Think of the allergenic Ambrosia artemisifolia, or some of the plants that are poisonous that can be eaten by livestock. So there's other damages weeds can cause. And when I say substantial, I mean enough to warrant some kind of management intervention. So say a different kind of weed management, management change, the farmer or the agricultural operator does something against them. Arable habitats, for the purpose of this presentation, will be fields, vineyards, orchards, and their fallows. So actively cultivated land plus its fallows. We're excluding pastures and grassland because the dynamics are a bit different there. So then we have the so-called sleeper weeds. Now we all know that biological invasions have a bit of a time lag sometimes, and sleeper weeds are those where we haven't realized that there are substantial damages coming from this species yet, or they haven't exhibited them yet. Sometimes they need to reach a critical threshold in an area to really exhibit that damage. Sometimes climate has changed, land use has changed, so the species then has the opportunity to really go wild. And when sleeper weeds wake up, to stay in this metaphor, they become emerging weeds. And these are the species I'm interested in. These are weeds showing a tendency towards spread and or increase of impact. So why study weeds? I've said this word now probably 25 times already. Weeds are the coolest group of species ever. That's the reason why. They are highly adaptable. And I mean, let's face it, we've managed to get quite a few species to the brink of extinction. Weeds are the only species that have fairly efficiently fought back or at least resisted. I mean, we've run targeted eradication campaigns against these species and we seem to not be able to get rid of them. And some basic principles of ecology and evolution are a bit different for weeds. For instance, if we think about herbicide resistance, which is a very modern topic in weed research, weeds rapidly evolve this resistance. In a couple of generations, all of a sudden, we have herbicides that no longer work. Also, the communities of weeds are somewhat chaotic. I mean, we have very cool communities, but through these large changes, we have very strange and different communities, and some people have tried to look at how these communities assemble. Also, you have to think about it this way. Every time the farmer plows the field, the community, except for the seed bank, gets put back to zero, and what's there next year depends on the crop, the management, the herbicide, etc. So you can have very different communities in different settings. And lastly, I'm from the Bioinvasions group, weeds are the original invasive species. They were the ones that we were fighting way before globalization happened, because they grow in places we don't want them to grow. So on the left side, I just reiterated Baker's definition of the evolution of weeds, and on the right side, Maho and colleagues have a very cool review that's titled Weeds Against the Rules. A bit of provocative things, and if people are ecophysiologists, I think you'll really like the right one. So, question to you all, what has changed in agriculture? Feel free to just shout it out. Anybody? Anything? Come on, don't be shy, I don't bite. Fields are bigger than they used to be. Yes?
It depends on time.
Depends on time. Let's say last 100 years-ish. Yeah? What would you say? What has changed?
Yeah, because the management it will change.
Like what?
Like using tractors.
Using tractors, exactly. Anybody else? Yeah?
We developed artificial fertilizer like nitrogen, I think.
Yes, very good. Artificial fertilizer, Haber-Bosch in 1916. Anybody else? Oh, somebody had an idea back there? Near the red jacket, maybe? No? Okay. Anyway, I think if we all sort of set our mind to it, we could be listing this until the end of my talk. Basically, not to answer a question with a question, but what has changed in agriculture? What really hasn't changed in the last 100 years? The thing that hasn't changed is crops are grown for profit. That's the system of agriculture in a nutshell. Now, there's a lot of publications that deal with the flora of arable habitats and all the consequences it has, also understanding combined impacts of weeds and climate change, trying to predict the future, so to say. But really, if I look at agriculture, here's what I see. So arable habitats are primarily influenced by climate, because you can't grow a crop, or you can't grow certain crops in certain areas because it's too cold or too hot or too dry. And extreme events, this is where, I mean, you've been here this summer, we've had a drought, I don't know if you noticed. So basically, this is also something that's becoming more and more present in arable habitats. What also has changed is crop species and crop rotation. We have new crops such as maize and canola. We also have differences in crop rotations over the last 100 years that are just huge and very strange, and sometimes crop rotation doesn't happen at all that much anymore. Agrochemicals, thank you for that comment in the back. We have synthetic fertilizer, synthetic herbicides, stuff like that, and mechanization and technology. We live in a really wild era, because in the last 100 years we've gone from the ox pulling a plow to the tractor, to the huge tractor that also delivers the herbicide, to now, I've heard this also happening already, drones spraying the herbicide controlled in fields. So we're really spanning a huge change here. Breeding and genetic manipulation, crops grown 100 years ago. The wheat that we grew then was not the wheat that we're growing now. It's very different. You can tell easily by the height. Wheat used to go to my hip, now it barely goes to my knee. So these are some of the differences. And lastly, more people require more food, so population increase. Economic trends, let's remember there used to be a very hard border between where I'm from, Austria, and here. So two very divergent economic patterns. Social trends, I mean, who here is a vegetarian? Of course, the more soy is being consumed, different other things are being consumed. You can now get rice from Austria, stuff like that is happening. And then, sadly, also underscored by the invasion of Ukraine, geopolitical conflicts have an influence on arable habitats. So if we look at just one of these things, which is land use change in Central Europe, we can see a general trend. So this is 1930 to 2010. The change in arable land area is pretty simply sort of split. We have Hungary, Slovakia, and Croatia with the increases. Austria is sort of half and half. Slovenia has a couple of increases. But net, this is a decrease, a couple percent. However, arable land is unevenly defined. I use the height data. You may find a somewhat different pattern if you use other data sets. They may differ in this modeling approach. And lastly, this is something that you maybe know, the former East is normally labeled USSR disaggregated, and for you in the Czech Republic, you have, of course, the Czechoslovakia disaggregated, so it's not always quite clear. I find this sharp border between Czech Republic and Slovakia rather interesting in their modeling approach, and I have to investigate a bit further what this data means. Same goes for Yugoslavia. So we know that arable habitats have been lost, but quantifying it is a bit of a different and more tricky story. So now let's come to a bit more in depth of what I have done. So step one, get data. It's very simple. It's the beginning of all the science. We already published a report on this data this summer. So what did we want? We wanted the perfect data set, of course. Nothing less would do. Exact positions like coordinates. We wanted data on the crops. This is super, super important because otherwise we have no inkling about the management. We wanted to know the crop species, the precise cultivar or variant. We wanted to know organic or conventional farming, and we wanted to know weed management data, of course. Well, then we wanted even sampling, but we soon realized even sampling was not going to happen. So how did we get it? Don't be scared, it's a bit of a complicated flowchart. First of all, the European Vegetation Archive, so thank you to the EVA people. Other databases, individual data holders, digitization, thank you for the gap filling database. And then we use different kind of plots that are normally gathered by agricultural experts. So when they try and estimate how much herbicide they use, they don't use cover, so Mont Blanc scale or something like that. They actually count individual seedlings per square meter. So they have an abundance measure, but you can't really compare it with what we would understand as a relevant. Yeah, then we checked and standardized crop info. This was, of course, differently processed for every different data set because everybody stores it differently. For instance, in EVA, you don't have a standardized sort of thing about the crop because many plots just simply don't have a crop because they're natural habitats. So then we had to use a species list, and it get to be a bit of a runaround. We standardized the taxonomy to the plant list, and then basically I had a lot of fun with R, Microsoft Excel, and Access, and going back and forth, and lots of email writing. Anyway, of the 60,000 plots received, we retained ultimately 33,000 around roughly. And yeah, what we got was this. So you can't always get what you want, but sometimes if you try, you get what you need. This is a distribution among some major crop types. We have way more detailed info than that. It's just harder to show. I still think we got the perfect data set. Results may vary, however. We did get crop data, which is really the unique thing about our database and makes it so cool in its evaluation. So, of course, again, under construction, the data work is never done. I'm already thinking of extending the database to new data. What was a bit of a hindrance was that the physical archives were closed. So you find a lot of data in institutes, in old cabinets, under tables, and in God knows how many places. However, I couldn't access, say, a lot of the large archives in Germany because of COVID. We're going to do a bit more of digitization. We also now have, for those EVA databases that have a habitat column where we could find a crop type, this information. We have to change the new taxonomy. We can maybe include some GBIF data that comes from plots. And basically the only message I want to say here is, if you find unlabeled, unknown plot data, maybe even in hard copy, please, please, please secure them. You don't have to do anything with them, but if you take a picture and somebody throws away that piece of paper, we still have a record. A lot of biodiversity studies need a solid baseline, and this baseline is going missing by people retiring, unclear labeling, just paper getting wet in flooding incidents in university basements and stuff like that. Yeah? Or whatever you can think of. And this is a real problem for really cool biodiversity studies. So, that was the database. And now, the big question, biodiversity question mark. We're currently in submission, so step 2 is analyze data. And what we did was first we asked a couple of questions. We used only the data in fields. You probably saw that there was very uneven sampling and different crop types may have different effects on the data, so let's use only fields. And fields have changed. We've already established that fact. So the first question is very simple and sort of straightforward. How have species changed over time? Are some species increasing, decreasing? And then of course we can ask some overall species, how large is species turnover? So are we seeing more and more species and less and less? And lastly, do species with different traits show different trajectories of change? What I mean with different traits is different demands on nutrients, different demands on temperature, different ways of dealing with drought, stuff like that. And also, are species that are typical for these arable habitats or for fields becoming more or less? And lastly, of course, invasion biology working group, are neophytes increasing, are archaeophytes increasing or decreasing, and are natives increasing or decreasing? So, quite the amount of questions. Here again, the study area. What you can see now on this map is basically the density of fields per 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell. So, as you can see, we are somewhere what here-ish. Yeah, very well sampled Czech Republic. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, roughly 22,000 plots spread out over these 9 decades. And what we did then is we took only species where we have 50 records or more, because the fewer records you have, the weirder the trends get, and then you can't really have a reliable estimate. Yeah, of course, as you can imagine, by any data set that was put together sort of post hoc, there are different sampling schemes used. The main difference that we were worried about was the bias in a priori site selection between the field center and the field margin. In simple terms, all this means is the weed scientists, the ones that are interested in crop impact, are in the center of the field. Why? Because this is where the crop impact happens. Whereas the biodiversity scientists, or the majority of this group here, are hopping along the margin, happy they found one more species. So you just have this diversity gradient that we can imply. Now, how to detrend that gradient? Because, as you know, coordinates come with uncertainty. Sometimes the uncertainty can be tens of meters, and that's basically, on this little sort of schematic I have here, that's enough to be 2 fields on. 10, 20 meters is the width of a strip, I know, because this is the fields that run from my parents' house, and you'll be somewhere else completely. Different crop, different everything. So you have to use some kind of a mathematical runaround. And I'm sorry, I know it's a bit late in the afternoon, but here comes the mathematics. Yeah. Althwaite and colleagues developed a method called occupancy modeling in 2018. It's a further development of previous occupancy models. Now, what occupancy is in real statistical terms, it's the probability of actually encountering a species at a certain site. Basically, for all intents and purposes, we can say occupancy is the mean number of grid cells occupied. So that means it's the range size, in a way. Yeah, the occupancy models are based on sites, so the 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells I showed you earlier. Every visit to a site gives you some kind of inkling of what the species growing in that site are. So that means every visit is one vegetation plot. And then, of course, over time, because we're interested in temporal trends, we block the time into decades because there are individual large studies, and if you do it annually, some years you have very few samples and some years you have more, and that can influence the results of it. And then comes the, well, right side of my slide. Basically what you do is you set up a model up here. This is the state model. This is the true unknown state. So if a species is present or absent in a site. This is what we don't know, really. And down here you have the observation model. Now, the lower model is the interesting one, because this is where you can model the process of observation. If any of you ever heard of meta-analysis, this is basically a meta-analysis down here, where you sort of think about how the different observations were made, different sampling schemes, and how they would influence this. And all we did here was place an effect onto this diversity gradient from the field center to the field edge. And this is then what corrects for this bias, at least for most of it. Yeah, I mean, now I guess you all have a very clear picture of what my results look like. Just to go through it, so what happens is I feed this model into the machines, and then it takes about 2 weeks. And every couple hours or so, a new species result comes up. This is really easy to interpret. Species occupancy, so in the 1930s, Agrostemma gisago was present in roughly half of all the grid cells, plus minus the confidence interval. And if we look to the present times, the species is getting rarer and rarer. Yeah? It's pretty simple. The green line is just a simple regression line, and we have these results for 359 species, so we can stack them. And then what we did was we took the last point, minus T1, and this was the occupancy change, so the change in range size over time, very simply put. And then this logarithm up here, ignore it, it's just for the model. We can look at how different species attributes predict the changes in occupancy. So what we did is the first two attributes, nutrients and soil pH, were sort of related to habitat change. So nutrients, of course, the fertilizer. Again, thank you for that comment. And soil pH is more relevant to habitat loss. So specifically acidic sites either being changed by improving the soil, or alkaline sites being given up because they're not productive enough. The second two species attributes were species temperature preference and soil moisture preference. These go more towards climate change, so what we expect at this point is that thermophilic species increase and drought tolerant species increase as well. And the last two traits are biogeography and arable habitats. Again, I mean, we extracted the biogeographic status with help from Irina Axmanova, who's right here in front of me, from various databases. It's a bit hard to tell in the arable flora what is an archaeophyte and what is a native, but we're pretty sure that we identified the neophytes correctly, and that's the more important compartment. And for species with an affinity to arable habitats, we basically used species diagnostic and common dominant for various Unis habitat types and Papaveretea rheatis. I have no idea how to anglicize this, but using syntaxonomic and Unis information combined. Yeah, the first four are, I guess you probably guessed at this point, Ellenberg-like indicator values that we used from all the areas overlapping the study region for which we had data also provided here by Irina. Yeah, these are the overall results. So every bar you see here represents one species. On the left you have the decreasing species. There were 186 species that showed decreases. And on the right you have the increasing 173 species. So you have one clear winner and one clear loser. These may be a bit artifacts, we're not quite sure about those, but otherwise you see a bit of a trend. You see obviously large turnover. I mean, you have a couple of species that sort of have remained the same, but many species are in sort of the 10% plus and minus range. And the median change is, interestingly enough, fairly equal. Minus 0.1%, not spectacular, and probably well within any kind of respectable margin of error. Now, I'm going to show you the same graph in several different colors, just to look at the patterns for the individual indicators we chose. Number one, nutrients. On the left side, you have the number of species decreasing and increasing. On the right side, you have the plot I showed before. So for nutrients, the trend is quite clear. We see that the more nutrient-demanding species are increasing on the top right, and the less nutrient-demanding species, or species adapted to nutrient-poor habitats, is maybe the better formulation for that, are decreasing. We can also see this pattern a bit. Here, next one, soil reaction. Here it's a bit harder to say. The pattern is a bit more complex because what you see is the species at the radical end, so more alkaline and more acidic on this graph are the ones that are decreasing, and the species along the neutral pH range are increasing. That's also a bit clear. Temperature, now that's a thinker, huh? What we see here is species with the preference for high temperatures are decreasing, species with the preference for low temperatures are a bit meh. Doesn't look so great. And soil moisture, this one was the one that really confused me for a bit. Species with a preference for, or drought-tolerant species, no species actually prefers dry conditions, are all sort of on the decreasing side. And here, if we go up the moisture gradient, this is where we see a bit of increases. So, rather strange. It did, however, work out very nicely for biogeographic origin. Here we see clearly neophytes are largely increasing, while natives and archaeophytes are a bit more balanced, but also a bit more decreases than increases. And lastly, the affinity to arable habitats. Here we can also see the pattern very clearly. Species decreasing, species typical or with a high affinity to arable habitats are clearly the ones decreasing, whereas species with no arable affinity that we can tell are a bit more increasing to balanced. Yeah. Now what we did then was we looked at, to see if these patterns were significant, we looked at a linear model for each individual predictor. I'm not going to go through everyone here. Oopsie. There we go. So, sorry about that. Basically, we saw here what we expected before. Nutrients are significant. The radical ends of the pH spectrum are significant negative predictors. Neophytes increase, native and archaeophytes decrease significantly. So that's also what's expected. Species with an arable affinity to arable habitats are also decreasing. Temperature has a negative effect, but in this case it's lucky that something's not significant because it's not significant, so probably more due to chance. And soil moisture here is very significant and has a positive effect. Now this is a bit of a thinker, but as you know, these traits are not individual traits, they're always some kind of strategy of a species. And species that are drought tolerant tend to be less competitive. They're more slow growing, so they can't acquire resources fast, especially under competition circumstances. Whereas species with a high preference for high moisture also normally have a preference for environments high in nitrogen. Examples always prove the rule here. Another thing is that there are effects of drainage and irrigation. I don't know if you noticed, but the species with 10 and 11, one of them was Phalaris arundinacea that increased, and this species actually grows in arable habitats along sort of drainage systems and in these situations, so maybe our architecture in the landscape has a bit of a cause here, maybe it's connected to nitrogen preference. And then if we look at all the predictors together, we have this picture, so nutrients remain significant, biogeography remains significant, and the affinity to arable habitats remains significant. So the question I'm having right now in my head is sort of, perhaps these traits don't tell quite the full story. Now with working with traits, we decided for Ellenberg values and the other two because they're fairly easy to get. Other traits are a bit more complicated, and the truth is that trait data has more holes than data in some cases, so it's a bit more complicated. However, come to some conclusions, and then I have a couple of next ideas. So before conclusions always come limitations. Why didn't we see more extinctions? It was rather frustrating because you'd think any kind of habitat type where there's so much change would see so many extinctions. Well, extinctions would happen first for rare species, and we excluded the rare species because of lack of data. And this is always the problem when working with rare species. You have few data because the species are rare, but then you also can't really work with that data. Now, the exclusion may have also caused a bit of an underrepresentation of neophytes, specifically those that haven't been present for long and are now maybe already moving into spread, because we have few records for those. Also, certain types of surveys exclude stands that are dominated by neophytes. I don't know if you know this, but if you're working with some classification schemes, etc., you may want to exclude these a priori from your study, just because it's hard to work with them sometimes, and also conservation ecology might not target neophyte overrun stands as often, and there's always residual bias in the data, which makes interpretation more complicated. Now, question one, how have species changed over time? Well, if we look at this rather symmetrical graph, it would sort of suggest in isolation no net loss, which is often the result of biodiversity studies. However, if we look at it at smaller scales, we do see net loss. We do see a lot of species going extinct. So maybe it's our filter that we had before, the issues that we had with that. There may be other factors at play. It's very unlikely. And also, just to point this out again here, losses of 40 to 60% of a range of a species is a signal of extinction, or at least a trend towards extinction. There's really no other way to interpret that. If you saw any species and you saw, okay, it has now 60% smaller range, well, there's really only one conclusion there. The second thing is, how large is species turnover? Well, it's huge. And of course, this may precede the loss of some species. And lastly, the different attributes that influence the change in occupancy that I showed are habitat change, neophyte invasion, and the loss of typical species, species with a high affinity towards arable habitat. So some sort of consequences for conservation. One, maintain extensively used sites, and if we're being completely honest, we have to recreate extensively used sites. They're just not present in the landscape anymore at the frequency that most species would need. There are some experiments going on, I'm assuming probably in every country at this point, but not on a large scale. Most of them are sort of local to regional, and they do show that a lot of these species build seed banks in the soil, and some of them actually do come back very quickly. Others, like the agrostemma I showed before, can be sown and then seed themselves. So there is a bit of hope here in the biodiversity context, and we haven't lost that much yet in this large study area. The other thing is monitor neophytes. Neophytes are species that are known to explosively spread in a region. They cause damage to crops, livestock, humans, but also simply to biodiversity. They're normally very competitive in these settings, and especially in more open settings like root crops or vegetables or other special crops, they can exhibit tremendous damage on biodiversity because these crops normally offer a bit more open space. Yeah, and we couldn't really show a significant effect of climate change on our data, which is a bit sad for somebody who works in the global change working group. However, climate change in the study region was roughly 2 degrees, maybe 2.5 and 3 in certain areas, which is not that much ultimately. However, climate change in the next 100 years is going to be significantly larger. So even though these effects were already large here, climate change is yet to become significant. So future climate change might really upset this entire balance even more. And then we'll see what happens, and maybe then we would see extinctions more readily happening. So the next idea is, of course, we chose 6 traits a priori, as you should do, and we evaluated them. There are other things you can look at with the same results. Life strategy, life form, generation time. The agrostemma I keep mentioning just because it's pretty and one of the nicer species to show, is an obligate annual. It does not build, at least does not build very large seed banks. And it used to be that it was transmitted with the seed for grains. And as seed cleaning improved, the seeds were lost, and thus it couldn't reproduce anymore. Because we were the ones that were basically sowing it into our cereal fields. So every species tells a bit of its own story. In this case, of course, obligate annuals are often losers in these situations. On the other hand, we have species photosynthetic pathway and grasses versus herbs. A lot of the weed literature reports an increase in C4 grasses, especially in cereals, so that might be a thing. Annuals, perennials, maximum height, because maximum height is a great stand-in for species competitive power, like growth rate, specific leaf area, seed bank longevity. So maybe some of these traits paint a bit more of the picture of change, and we will need that because ultimately Stenka and my end goal is to predict the top 20 emerging weed species. So we still need to give that a bit of work. So this next section is again under construction, and I sort of titled it the human component. Here is where we look at, we've done the past and the present, and now we're sort of moving a bit more into the future perspective. So I said earlier, you know, humans created agricultural ecosystems, arable systems. We created these habitats for these species. So it's all of our influences that create them. And we're trying to assess that. So these sort of 3 compartments are the ones that are more directly controlled by farmers, because farmers decide crop species, rotation, and all of these things. So we decided to ask farmers what they thought. Because of the language barrier, I don't speak Czech, in case you were wondering. We use Austrian farmers. We did distribute the link to 40,000 farmers between January and April of this year. Basically, every online survey contained 15 pre-selected emerging weed species we got from the literature, in this case, Phytolacca americana. And we asked them, do you recognize this species from your land? So is this species already growing? And second, how high would you estimate the management effort for this species? Sadly, only 183 farmers replied. So I would have loved to compare Austria, because this is the eastern part, we're somewhere up here, which is significantly warmer, has different crops, and the western part here, which is cooler, because a lot of the emerging weed species are somewhat thermophilic, so they tend to benefit from climate change, and it would have been super cool to see that. Well, with what, 5 samples here maybe, this of course is not going to work. However, what we did see is that farmers see change first. Now, Biodiversity change was noticed by farmers. We asked them if the weed flora on their land has changed, and over half strongly agreed. So they are seeing the change. Number two, weeds that have never been on my land are now present. Even more overwhelming majority. So farmers do see things, and it's really important, and I have to underscore this here, that farmers are really important in this context. Once harmless weeds now cause damage. This is sort of thinking about species that are thermophilic, so they could always exist in Austria maybe, but now with less late frosts, warmer winters, they can actually become damaging weeds. I would call them maybe re-emerging weeds because they were always here. But now they exhibit the damage because they can. We have, well, not quite half, but let's be generous, say around half here. And lastly, I have weeds on my land I can barely control with the usual methods, and roughly 1/3 agrees. So farmers are seeing changes. Farmers are also somewhat frustrated with the changes, which is understandable. Now, in terms of the species, I'm not going to go through every one of these species individually. These were the 15. The median number of species recognized was 6 species per farmer. The minimum was 0, the maximum was 15, so all of them. The number of species recognized was not significantly different between organic and conventional farms. Sometimes it's claimed that organic farms have more weed species. It's not quite the case. However, differences between conventional and organic, left column and right column in this graph, can be seen in terms of the management effort and the frequency of recognition. So different species, sometimes organic farms have to till and plow the land more often because they're a bit limited in what kinds of herbicides they use. So they select for maybe different environments, a bit of different environmental conditions. What was interesting is we were sort of expecting the management effort for the organic farmers, right column, to be way higher. So sort of the trend here with the fallopias, which we grouped into one. However, we also found, xanthium, that the trend in conventional farms was higher than management effort. So this is a bit still of a puzzle. Maybe it's due to the sample size. We had 36 organic farmers, so maybe if we had more reporting, we get a bit more details out of this. Maybe there are tillage differences, there are different herbicide efficacies and different herbicide resistance mechanisms. So all of these things may differ between the farm types and cause these differences, but it's actually rather interesting. And this is sort of now in its final stage of evaluation. We're looking at a couple more things, such as farm traits, such as farm size, of course, because the larger your farm, the more likely you are to have these weed species, etc., etc. Yeah. And let's think about this for a minute again. Right up here. So population, socioeconomic trends and conflicts. Now our study area is just so beautifully split straight down the middle by the former Iron Curtain, or was split for the better part. And if you think about how it was, of course nobody here is old enough to think about how it was, but if you try and think about how it might have been before that, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Czechoslovakia, these regions were one. There was probably no difference. East and West Germany are probably the best case. Along the border, the Iron Curtain, or with the former Iron Curtain, agriculture was probably practiced no different. So we have this really cool case study to look at these two different economic systems and how these systems influenced agriculture. Now, of course, I did a quick Google search and found out that there already is such a study. However, this was on a highly local scale. So a few villages, 324 plots, so what, 162 west and 162 east. And they argue that because the former Eastern Europe had these large, extensively used fields, the edges were not as fewer, and the margins and the edges of the field is where the biodiversity happens. Now, I would argue, this is the second point, that extensively used fields have within-field biodiversity in certain patches where the soil is a bit more free-draining, and there are lots of different things within the field. An intensively managed small field is very homogeneous. An extensively managed large field has within-field differences. I mean, you can see this if you just take a glance here. This is the Austro-Hungarian border. You do see that this sort of field size effect has an echo until today, and that's been shown in quite a couple of analyses. So the edge effect is probably still a thing. However, I think there's a bit more to it. Now, socioeconomic differences. So, I mean, you probably know this, but the West had a market economy, the East had a planned economy. Ownership in the West was private and public. Small fields, large fields, high intensity, low intensity. The trade was mainly within the former West and within the former East. There are cross-Iron Curtain trades at some point happening, but it's significantly fewer. And that's also a very, very important vector for invasive species and weed species in general to spread. Spreading with hay, spreading with grain exports, and stuff like that. So there may be very different things happening here. And in the former East, we have a bit of a later onset of mechanization in agriculture. So this also might have an effect. Of course, we can then also ask the question, the numbers under the country names are the EU accession dates. So what happened after these countries all became the same? Because in this study area, only Switzerland and Liechtenstein are not part of the EU Common Agricultural Policy. So there were more effects here that are quite interesting to study because it ultimately is all down to human agency. What I think is important, and one of my co-authors who is from former Eastern Germany does tend to make that point a bit, is you have to be aware of othering here. I mean, I guess you all know that, and I might be preaching to the choir here, but othering is the process of seeing one side, the former West, as the norm, and the other side as the divergence. And I guess that's a bit unscientific and also not so smart, but it's really important because a lot of publications and reports are written with an other perspective, so comparing me, the norm, to the former East, and it's a bit tricky in interpretation. We have to really see these as diverging lines. Now the other thing I will say is that the data in this situation might be a bit more tricky. As there was large economic competition, some of these productivity reports may represent more political documents. I've already talked about disaggregation issues. So we'll see. But the idea I have so far is the question is, how did the socioeconomic differences in former Western and Eastern Europe influence species number per plot, number of neophytes, and maybe even individual species? Now, I've shown you the database samples here just in a density map. Again, Czech Republic right here. Here we have a large sample. However, of course, they're temporally different. So if I were to show you this for every decade, you'd have sometimes in the north, sometimes in the south. So step one is, oops, sorry about that, a regression of whatever sub-question we're trying to head against climate. So basically taking the climatic trend out of the data and then using the residuals, so what remains, to look at the socioeconomic system per decade. And this is how far I've gotten with this. I think this is going to be the next and last publication during my PhD, I hope. Yeah, of course we have Yugoslavia, which presents the mixed case. Where fields were still small, land ownership was still kept private, but at the same time socialism was happening. So it's a bit of a different scenario again. So maybe there's actually a divergence in 3 than more in 2. So there's a lot of things to think about. Now I have come to the end. I hope I'm not all that early. And there's a lot of thanks to be said. First of all, thanks to the money people, the Austrian Climate Research Program, that's always important. Also thanks to my supervisors, Franz Essler and Stefan Dullinger. Then I have project partners, one of which you know. We have a scientific advisory board. We have many colleagues, some of whom are here, so thank you in person again. And we have overall smart technicians and brilliant modelers that have given me not only intellectual but also a lot of emotional support when developing these things. And last but not least, thanks to you, and ask me anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for this nice and very condensed presentation. But still, I think we will have a question, so now it's yours.
Thanks, Vicky. I like the questionnaires that you did produce for the farmers. And I was wondering, how did you select the species you were asking about? Because there is like 25 species. If there was some per selection, or you gave them more and showed us just some of them.
What we did was, I mean, we wanted to select more, but it was sort of a multi-stepped informed approach. So first things first, what in Austria we have, I don't know if you have this here, we have so-called regional plant protection experts. They work with our regional chambers of agriculture. So we emailed them sort of an interview sort of guideline where they told us a species list. There's the European Pest EPPO, I don't know what the two P's stand for, but it's an organization that tracks weeds and weed management issues, so we used their lists. And then we combined it with the results from our occupancy modeling, so species that increased there, and that's how we came up with a condensed list, because the problem was the more species you ask, the more farmers start to leave the questionnaire in the middle. And that was also here already a problem, because you already 15 times 2 clicks is already a lot of work to be done for somebody. And so there's always a bit of a compromise there. We did an expert system assessment ultimately. Yeah?
Thanks for the presentation, it's very nice. I would like to ask about this interpretation of this plot with the losses and the gains.
Yep.
As a no net loss. I would perhaps say that you have losses, and once a loss occurs, it is like irreparable. Well, it's not it's tragic, but I mean, to say that there is no net loss is to say that there is a zero-sum game, that I don't see as a solid hypothesis.
I think a very good point, actually, that there's a ethical and philosophical debate about no net loss. Just because some species are compensating the gains doesn't mean we're not losing the species. I wholeheartedly agree, and it's important. There's been an ongoing debate in biodiversity science about this specific topic, because some species, probably less true for agricultural habitats, but some species will just simply not be able to exist, so should we replace them? Open question.
And probably many of the species which are increasing now are not increasing because the others were so competitive and are decreasing that they can now take over. But
yep.
They are different. I mean, ones are decreasing for other reasons, and the other. So it's not that the extinction of ones helps the increasing of the others.
I mean, in case of arable habitats, I'm pretty sure that you're right. There is actually a biotic resistance hypothesis that I would sort of refer you to, in that sense that some habitats that are highly diverse have been shown to resist invasions more efficiently than others. However, results may vary. There's several different publications, many different opinions about that. But on average, for this specific case, I think you're right, that the competition is less of an issue than establishment competition. Basically, every year before the crop is, or after the crop is sown, so land is plowed, crop is sown, it's whoever gets out of the seedling stage first and can push everybody else away and crowd everybody else out. So that's sort of a reset every year. For other habitats, that may be less true. But yes, I think you're completely right that the loss of individual species is a problem, irrelevant if it's compensated or not. And those are maybe two different conversations also.
I will maybe also comment on those occupancy models. You explained the graphs of the Ellenberg indicator values, and you explain each part of the graphs, and you said that it needs more thinking. But when we saw that you lost some extremes, and you showed the graphs that a lot of arable fields are also changed to some perennial grasslands or something like that, so it may be the result that some fields which are not useful for farmers, not so important, so either very dry or very wet, were abandoned.
Yep.
And so you can see in your graphs that the extremes are lost, and the generalists, so the ideal position for the crops are those pretty
Yep.
dominant.
I mean,
it affects the weeds also.
That seems to be quite the case for a lot of studies in Europe. They all say that the more ubiquitous, so I mean the hypothesis is now called the rich get rich and the poor get poorer. So those species that have large ranges, that are very common, that are normally or even always generalists, those become more and more common, whereas the specialists that have a more narrow niche, they get lost progressively. Sorry, there was another.
I think this can be due to interaction in Ellenberg values of reaction values with nutrient values.
Yep.
because like in the middle where you have intermediate reaction, these are species with often with high nutrient values. But if you have
sorry.
Yes. Well, I know. So I saw the manuscript, but species are evaluated as extremely acidophilous or extremely basiphilous if this acidity of the substrate or basicity can be manifested. Yeah. And it's usually in the absence of a high amount of nutrients. Yeah. So you need to have outcrop of granite and it's acidic, or outcrop of limestone and it's basic. And if it's outcrop, it has extreme pH values but low nutrient status. And this is what Ellenberg observed in the field, and that's why he constructed indicator values like this.
I completely agree, and just because you said outcrop now, that's also of course another effect in agriculture. Anything that's steep, rocky, a slope is normally something that's abandoned or converted into a different use. Maybe terraced for wine a bit, but on average it's abandoned as use as a field because it's just not manageable on the scale that we practice agriculture today.
This was visible in comparison of the losses of the arable land and grass.
And also comment on this net loss versus exchange. This could be maybe approached in terms of temporal beta diversity and its components like nestedness and turnover. So net loss or net gain is consistent with nestedness. So in time, the nestedness of the community is changed, and if there is no net loss, it can still mean high beta diversity because turnover is high, or it can mean like low beta diversity because there is no turnover. So there are basically like three states. Loss or gain, net loss, no change in number, exchange in species identity, and no change in number and no change in species identity.
Exactly. I mean, this is, I think, also something that needs to be decomposed. I think on a scale, the scale that we were on sort of prohibits that decomposition. There is, however, now, what's his name, Biogeography, who has a new package out, by the way, for people studying beta diversity, called BetaDiv, and it's about identifying hotspots in beta diversity. He works with, see now that I am not talking to Clara alone anymore, he works with identifying hotspots of beta diversity change. So if we had a data set for that, would be interesting to correlate over a map to see where are the hotspots. They only work with paired plots so far, however. However, he's still planning on extending that. He has several PhDs working on it right now. And that's actually, I think, also where a lot of the science is now where it's at. From the macroecological perspective, and because we didn't have so much management data, it's very hard to tell because a lot gets lost in the details. I mean, there are several studies, one from Czech Republic, I think you did with, was it Diana Simonova? Where you looked at synanthropic vegetation. And Nina Richner in Switzerland did, where she was able to look at really the details of management and these changes as well. Because the smaller you scale, the easier it is to get all these details, and she had good baseline data as well. So those studies really allow us to go in detail. And I always have to say like that those kind of local studies are really important. So even if you think, you know, wow, I will never get 22,000 sample size, yeah, a lot of information gets lost on the way to 22,000. And that's really important that we think about that too. There?
No, much earlier. In the beginning when you explained the species occupancy model.
Ah, yeah. There we go.
Yeah. So this is a generalized linear model, no?
It's a Bayesian inference on a generalized linear model, yes.
And what's the driver? How do you assign the...
So basically we have, this is a logit transformation in the observation model. I think this is what you're referring to. We have a ton of priors and hyperpriors. Sorry for making everybody dizzy with this slide skipping here. But there is also a slide on that, and you will see once you see the slide that that's why I didn't use it. So basically this is the model you've seen before, and then you have a full list of priors. The trick in the occupancy model that I used is this, wait a minute, where am I? Give me a second here. Yeah, exactly. So the B is the decade effect on occupancy, and what is very unrealistic is if you choose the effect of the decade for every decade at random, you get really eccentric species curves that are just unbelievable. Yeah? So that's why we use the first B is drawn from a normal distribution with mu B and 0.001, and the second B is drawn from a normal distribution centered on this B, centered on the B from the previous decades. It's basically the most simple kind of smoothing function, because otherwise you have species where you know that they oscillate very slowly, that have 90% occupancy, 5% occupancy, and jump between those extremes, and that's a mess. Any other prior or hyper-prior questions I can answer?
Yeah, but as far as I know, hyper-priors are like the random effects, you know?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, the priors here are the random effects, exactly. So what you do is, just so everybody can follow the people now talking about priors, is you have to make some kind of reasonable assumption about what your thing would look like. You know this from frequentist, which is the opposite of Bayesian statistics. You make an assumption about your p-value, you make an assumption about the data being reasonably normal. Here you do it the other way around. You choose a prior in a certain shape. So here we chose normal priors, one uniform prior, and one Cauchy is half of only the positive side of the normal. Yeah? So those are the assumptions we take on these functions. In the model I also have a Bernoulli function. A site can be occupied 0 or 1. There's no difference. Yeah?
And with the state model you can, I guess, make predictions.
Exactly. The state model is the one that generates a hypothetical effect. So it basically says, okay, let's pretend for a second that at this site it was occupied. And then you have your data, and by contrasting the state model with the data, you can say, how likely is it that we make this observation given this state and this observation model? And then through the magic that is Markov chain Monte Carlo, you can get these nice sort of simple graphs again.
Have you tried to simulate these losses and gains in these species occupancies in the future?
That's a tricky one, because we didn't use any environmental data on this. Because the problem is we're trying to get the bias out of a database, and the second you include, say, temperature increase or something like that, you don't really know in the end what your trend figure is made up of. So predicting to the future would probably be better served in an SDM approach, like a species distribution model, using the past data. Yeah? What was really important about this is that our database really only has arable habitats, because for a lot of the common arable species, Arabidopsis thaliana, you get millions of points on GBIF, but you don't know in what habitat context. This is why we use this approach, because in SDM, I mean, most of the species from arable habitats, or a lot of them, are fairly common. You can find them in many sort of places. Some of them are grassland species, some of them also occur in urban environments, and that's why we didn't just simply fit, yeah? We're talking simply fit 359 SDMs, because then you get a bit of problems, because some of the sites were maybe more urban and different situations. There are, however, ways to combine the two. Any other questions for the priors?
Let's speak about the patterns, because maybe it will be much more understandable for other people.
Yeah, so what are the most declining species and what are the most increasing species? Yes.
There we go. Top and bottom, I think it's 20. I didn't count them. So the most decreasing species is Persicaria dubia, Agostema gitago, Valerianella dentata. Here, this sort of gap effect, I mean, I believe Persicaria dubia is somewhat wet preferring, so this may be an effect of the drainage of wet meadows or wet fields that maybe are no longer wet because they were then eventually drained, something like this. On On the other side, we see Geranium molle, a species that's fairly highly debated because it's endangered in the Czech Republic. Now, everybody beware, mass modeling always means dealing with artifacts and implausible results. Stenka and I had a bit of a go-around on that one.
I am just thinking that those are really specialists. So,
yeah.
Diagnostic species of arable wheat vegetation.
Yeah.
Those are generalistic species. Let's forget the winner and the
yeah. And that's clearly also the resource-sparing, more drought-tolerant species on the left side that have these more narrow niches and just simply can't compete.
I don't know, like Geranium molle can be an error or an artifact, but on the other hand, it's a Mediterranean species. Huh?
Yeah. Maybe I'm thinking just about Czech Republic, and we have data from northern Italy, Austria.
I mean, it is one of the species, I mean, one of the things that sort of is interesting. If you look at the Q, has a range maps and invaded a native range. This Geranium molle has been pretty much globalized. So it is capable of spreading. So if maybe the decreases in the Czech Republic are counterweighted by increases everywhere else, that's of course also a thing. I mean, on the right side, you also see some species. Let me see that are really more generally common, but sometimes even come all the way into urban environments and stuff like that. Maybe also along roadways, which could be a corridor of spread for some of them. You know, the chamomile that's at Askim, those are all not specific, not specialists in by any means, and they occur in many environments. This also might be a reaction to how species deal with extreme events. Species with broader environmental niches are more resistant to extreme events, they can recolonize quicker, and that can be a mechanism of spread. That's one of the things that we would have to look at with the life strategy of the species.
Did you compare also the species pools of weeds for different countries? If there is something specific for Austria, for example, what we do not have? And if it is coming in the near future?
No, not yet. We had a bit of a snack there. We actually wanted to look at, say, the species from Italy, Croatia, so and Slovenia, so the sort of the part of the study where the borders are Mediterranean. Because what we do know for some groups of species is that they're shifting progressively north, and we can see that now also in a lot of data analyses. The problem is we don't have enough data from these southern regions. Croatia is okay-ish, Italy is the problem. Yeah? Because there's not that much data from Italy, sadly. One would think, but we assumed that there would be more, so it's a bit hard to assess them. And also, again, a lot of the thermophilic species may be more specialized. Again, that might not be how it shakes out. Italy also has a bit of a different issue because, especially in the Po Valley, it became very pertinent this summer. Halotolerance becomes this thing because the water pressure by the outflowing rivers creates a positive pressure that pushes away the seawater. And every couple of years in a drought, that switches and seawater comes in. So the salt tolerance of the wheat seems to be a very decisive point there. Also, this year might be interesting to study, comparing last year and next year, because this is what happened this year. It happened last time, I think, 30 years ago-ish. Yeah, another project.
Do you have any other slide which was hidden?
Okay, this is the larger Agri-Wheat Clim project. Top 10, top 20, priors, hyperpriors. This is the correlation diagram. I mean, I can just reiterate this. We have the correlation of nutrients and soil moisture. Of course, temperature and soil moisture are negatively correlated, no surprises there. And I mean, it's not too high, but if we look at the pH and temperature, they're correlated positively. So what we said before, basically in this discussion. This is just predictor completeness and very colorful. Just to show we had very few data gaps ultimately, because the Ellenberg indicator values for Europe that we used have now recently become available, and that was a huge help because initially we had huge data gaps in these Ellenberg indicator values, and that was really a hindrance to the modeling effort. Yeah, just to show this was actually important. Our results are not spatially explicit. That means we can't show where which species has increased. That's a bit of a drawback of this method. There is a method called the Mescado Algorithm and several others that are way more sophisticated. The problem is they require way more data and more runtime and computing power. This was the runtime for every individual species here. Most of them are between 0 and 1 hour, 0 and, what is this, 10, 15, 20, and then we reach sort of the 2-day mark, and that's where it gets really tricky. I also ruined one of my PCs trying to run it on the PC, so it gets a bit tricky very quickly. I mean, I love mass modeling efforts. I think everybody should try looking at the big data picture more, but here we run into the point where you have to rent and buy additional server space, and that gets very expensive very quickly. Of course, if you have the financial capacity to rent Amazon for an hour, it's very easy. Yeah, then there's nothing in the way of this. And this was actually done for Germany, and they have very cool sort of species extinction and species turnover maps, basically. Look at the occupancy changes per grid cell in Germany. Recommend you really check that publication out. The Mescado algorithm needs a lot more data,